Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating, almost unbelievable origins of a figure who would eventually reshape the criminal underworld in Europe. Forget everything you think you know about how crime bosses are made, because the story of Klaas Bruinsma begins not with a bang, but with a whisper in the quiet streets of post-war Netherlands. Born in 1953, Klaas entered a world still stitching itself back together after the devastation of World War II. Imagine Europe, slowly healing, rebuilding, with scarcity and informal markets still a part of daily life. In this seemingly ordinary setting, there was no grand prophecy, no flashing sign pointing to his future. His birth was just like any other, a quiet event in a time of widespread recovery. The hospital records, the neighbors' chatter, nothing hinted that this seemingly average boy would one day become a name synonymous with power in European courts, surveillance files, and hushed conversations across busy ports. His beginnings were, surprisingly, incredibly normal. No silver spoon, no dramatic hardship, just the everyday reality of a city that was still calm, still unready for the colossal impact one of its own sons would eventually have. He wasn't born into a life of crime, nor was he marked by some grand destiny. His childhood simply unfolded, much like anyone else's, in an atmosphere far removed from future conflict. But here's where it gets interesting. Even in this tranquil setting, a crucial ingredient for those who later navigate hidden economies began to simmer. An early, almost unconscious awareness that systems could be read, understood, and even maneuvered. Young Klaas wasn't about open rebellion. He was a master observer. He watched. He saw adults negotiate, bend rules, make private deals, and improvise around shortages that were still a hangover from wartime rationing. Think about it. Post-war Holland, a society that appeared formal and orderly on the surface. But beneath that, a vibrant, invisible network of mini-markets and informal trade thrived. A boy growing up in this environment absorbs something invaluable, something schools rarely teach. The knowledge that official channels and real-world behavior often tell two very different stories. His education didn't lead him to conventional academic excellence or a path in established institutions. Instead, it equipped him with a different kind of literacy, a deep understanding of social systems, logistical patterns, how trust networks operate, and the subtle cues in human behavior. Teachers and administrators didn't see him as a genius or a troublemaker. He was just there, a neutral presence. But sometimes neutrality, or even invisibility, can be far more influential than brilliance. Highly visible students get flagged early, but the future architects of complex systems often blend into the background. Klaas was one of them. Not the smartest, not the loudest, not a disruptive force either. He was simply a boy, quietly accumulating patterns, absorbing information, without ever drawing attention to himself. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible evolution. Then came the 1960s, a period of massive transformation for the Netherlands. It was shifting, becoming a dynamic hub of trade, mobility, and evolving border policies. Airports, vast ports, and the burgeoning principles of an open market were rapidly transforming the country into one of Europe's natural logistical crossroads. Imagine a teenager growing up in a nation that's silently becoming a transit spine for an entire continent. He was, unknowingly, growing up within the future opportunities that this transformation would bring. Klaas's adolescence perfectly coincided with the rise of European circulation, the very phenomenon that would, years later, allow covert networks to piggyback on the back of legitimate commerce flows. He was, without even realizing it, synchronizing his formative years with the formative years of a vast, yet-to-be publicly defined market. It was an accidental apprenticeship in the mechanics of a new world. His social environment during youth also provided another crucial training ground: the art of trust management. In the underworld, trust isn't something you learn as an adult. It's rehearsed in childhood. He experimented with small circles, understood social risks, learned about compartmentalized honesty, and the power of selective disclosure. He grasped early on that people reveal far more when they believe they aren't being watched than when they're under direct scrutiny. This seemingly minor insight, honed in adolescence, would become an absolutely vital asset when he eventually ran covert operations that needed to stay one step ahead of observers. Dutch culture during that era presented a fascinating paradox that subtly shaped him. Publicly tolerant, yet privately strict. This duality trained a certain type of mind to become multi-layered, compliant and respectable on the surface, but calculating and strategic underneath. Klaas's psychological formation truly benefited from this dual stack. He internalized the skill of appearing acceptable to institutions, while simultaneously cultivating a second layer of intentions that those very institutions couldn't even begin to read. The real suspense in his life didn't begin when he first entered the world of crime. It began the moment he realized that this dual self-presentation was a functional, almost essential model for survival. Economic realism also came to him early. He observed that the legitimate economy often rewarded patience, certifications, strict hierarchy, and conformity. In stark contrast, the informal economy celebrated speed, adaptability, asymmetrical advantages, and private alliances. He didn't loudly rebel against the formal world. He simply chose not to pledge his loyalty to it. While his peers anchored their futures to degrees, secure jobs, and official promotions, Klaas developed no such attachments. A person unanchored to official hierarchies is inherently free to gravitate towards alternative value systems when they emerge. It was a silent divergence, a path chosen not with defiance, but with a quiet, calculated understanding of different kinds of value. By his late teenage years, he began to interact with early informal trade networks. These weren't the massive operations that would later define his infamous name. These were merely training grounds. These environments allowed him to study how goods could be moved discreetly, how misreporting could occur without confrontation, how intermediaries could skim value without collapsing the entire chain, and how trust chains could be enforced without the need for legal contracts. The true suspense of his adolescence wasn't in outward incidents, but in this inward calibration. He was meticulously rehearsing the grammar of non-official exchange. As he transitioned into adulthood, the Netherlands itself was also transforming into a more connected European economy. This synchronicity, this perfect alignment, is what later allowed his ascent, not through brute force, but through impeccable timing. His early adulthood wasn't marked by loud ambition or grand declarations. It was marked by alignment, an alignment with a continent whose newfound openness was inadvertently creating gaps that even official economists couldn't yet map. A gap remains invisible until someone identifies it by exploiting it. Klaas Bruinsma would become one of those individuals who didn't just spot these gaps, but strategically used them to build an empire. His entry into covert commerce didn't begin with a dramatic confrontation. It began with the cold, hard logic of logistics. He recognized that the Netherlands, with its strategic ports, its open borders, and its inherently tolerant environment, was mathematically perfectly suited to become a quiet, efficient transit point. Long before he became a notorious headline, he operated like a calculator. He meticulously mapped flows, evaluated enforcement weaknesses, and studied how legitimacy could ironically act as the perfect camouflage for illegitimacy when both shared the same infrastructure. That profound insight is precisely what later made his network so incredibly resistant to detection. It wasn't about raw speed or aggressive tactics, but about intelligent proximity to legal corridors. He didn't leap into the field as a reckless participant. He entered as someone who deeply understood that the primary advantage belonged to those who understood supply chains far better than the very people tasked with policing them. His initial steps into illicit trade were incremental, carefully studied, and meticulously structured. He behaved as if he were conducting a long-term experiment, testing the architecture of trust, pinpointing timing windows, and assessing corridor reliability. While others chased quick, immediate gains, he pursued proof of concept. This is exactly why, in later years, he was able to scale his operations to an unprecedented level. Scaling is simply never an option for those who never take the time to prototype small, to test and refine their methods. The true suspense in the first phase of Klaas Bruinsma. Life isn't found in dramatic incidents. It's in the quiet, methodical suspense of evolution. Picture an unremarkable boy in Amsterdam, sitting unnoticed in classrooms, walking ordinary streets, living without any fanfare or warning signs. This seemingly average boy was silently loading the cognitive software required for a future where the Netherlands would become an unannounced gateway, and he, the unseen architect pulling the strings behind the curtain. This period, from his childhood right through his early formation, is where the roots of his later empire were truly planted. It was a foundation built on observation over display, meticulous structure over impulsive action, strategic invisibility over a desire for spectacle, and precise timing over brute force. When the world later questioned how one Dutch figure managed to position the Netherlands as such a powerful, silent corridor without early warning signals, the answer isn't to be found in his adulthood. It exists right here, in a quiet boyhood that trained him to see what others lived inside, but simply failed to notice. But with meticulous planning and an uncanny understanding of human nature and logistical systems, it is a masterclass in how to build something massive without anyone even realizing it as being built. When Bruinsma first stepped into the shadow economy, he wasn't thinking about grand declarations or immediate power grabs. He was calibrating. He was testing the waters, like an engineer proof-testing a new design. He imagined invisible routes, theoretical networks, and then he painstakingly checked if they behaved the same way in reality. His beginnings were humble, small consignments, building trust one tiny link at a time, and making modest promises. He wasn't rushing for profit. He was experimenting to see if a complex network could be built, not through brute force, but through pure anticipation. He wanted to predict who would talk, who would defect, who would actually deliver, and who would crumble under the slightest pressure. His early years weren't about making big money. They were about mapping the human element within an illegal supply chain. His biggest advantage? He never acted like a gambler. Most people who enter the world of contraband are driven by urgency, by desperation, and that urgency makes them vulnerable to mistakes, surveillance, and betrayal. But Bruinsma? He acted like he had all the time in the world. He treated every early operation like a dress rehearsal for something much, much bigger that hadn't even taken shape yet. This difference in perspective, thinking in cycles, not just individual transactions, created a massive psychological gap between him and his competitors. They were focused on today's quick score. He was meticulously rehearsing for a network that literally required tomorrow to exist. As he perfected these proof-of-concept operations, he simultaneously cultivated something crucial: reputation. Not fame, but a quieter, far more valuable kind of reputation in illicit economies: reliability. In this world, reliability isn't about loyalty or morality. It's about pure, cold predictability. If you deliver when you say you will, if you conceal what you promise to conceal, and if you compensate fairly when necessary, you earn a currency far more potent than cash. You earn the willingness of others to structure their own risks around you. By his mid-20s, Bruinsma had exactly that. People were actively willing to align their own fortunes and hazards with his forecasts. That shift, when strangers start reorganizing their entire world around your predictions, that's the true birth of an underworld career. And while he was building this, the European environment was unknowingly creating the perfect conditions for his ambitions to flourish. Borders were softening, trade agreements were multiplying, shipping was accelerating, and the resources for inspection were thinning out compared to the sheer volume of goods moving around. What's more, legitimate commercial activity became an excellent camouflage blanket. Bruinsma understood something that even law enforcement hadn't quite grasped yet. Once legal trade reaches a certain scale, the capacity to monitor it simply doesn't keep up. Illicit logistics could then effortlessly piggyback on that asymmetry. He also recognized that the Netherlands, with its incredible port infrastructure and a culturally tolerant environment, wasn't just a country, it was a powerful platform. He began to gradually transition from being just a participant in the trade to becoming its organizer. And this transition is absolutely critical. A participant just moves goods. An organizer moves the people who move the goods. He wasn't building a simple linear supply chain. He was constructing a lattice, a complex structure where no single node held the complete map. Knowledge was compartmented, and intermediaries only handled fragments of the chain, never able to reassemble the whole picture. This is why his network, later on, survived long enough to become truly significant. It was built with inherent failure tolerance. If one unit collapsed, the design prevented that collapse from spreading throughout the entire system. His choice of hashish as a central commodity in the 1970s and 80s wasn't impulsive. It was a strategic masterstroke. Hashish, unlike substances that draw immediate attention, could be moved in massive quantities amidst global trade without triggering instant panic. It offered scale without spectacle, generated revenue without excessive noise, and provided international sourcing options that aligned perfectly with geopolitical instability in supplier regions. Bruinsma recognized that markets driven purely by demand aren't as powerful as markets driven by sheer repeatability. Hashish distribution had a reliable, repeatable rhythm, and that rhythm could sustain an entire network. At this stage, he was no longer experimenting. He was consolidating. He expanded from using local intermediaries to establishing international touchpoints, from short-range corridors to elaborate multi-leg logistical arcs. He built in redundancy everywhere. Alternate routes, alternate handlers, alternate cover stories. So, a disruption in Amsterdam wouldn't cripple operations in Rotterdam, and a problem in Rotterdam wouldn't shut down everything in Belgium or Germany. This level of decentralization was rare among early European traffickers, making him less a simple dealer and more a visionary architect. His reputation within the underworld began to change categories entirely. He wasn't seen as a reckless profit chaser. He was seen as a system builder. And system builders attract a different kind of ally. Not mere opportunists, but structural participants who crave stability and continuity. Bruinsma became that continuity. Once you reach this threshold, scaling stops being a struggle against resistance and becomes driven by pure expectation. People start seeking you out because you represent stability. That's when an illicit enterprise stops being fragile and becomes infrastructural. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, his network was no longer just local news. It was a continental phenomenon, yet without a single public headline. Ports moved his product unknowingly, banks laundered his revenue without seeing it, and seemingly legitimate businessmen cooperated with him without ever naming it. He thrived in the gaps between departments, the blind angles between jurisdictions, those zones where accountability falters because responsibility is so diffuse. His power, unlike the flashy cinematic portrayals of mob figures, didn't come from intimidation. It came from his perfect alignment with these structural blind spots. His life during this incredible ascent wasn't flamboyant. He didn't need lavish displays to project authority. His true leverage resided in the quiet, undeniable fact that he could move vast volumes of goods without interruption, and seamlessly replace anyone who failed without destabilizing the entire chain. Those who understood logistics truly understood his strength. Those who only understood violence couldn't possibly decode him. That very divide protected him. Authorities were often looking for the wrong kind of signature. By the time Europe began to awaken to the sheer scale of the network he had engineered, it was already deeply entrenched. Infrastructure, once it's embedded, isn't easily undone by mere awareness. Even investigative awareness inevitably lags behind architectural advantage. Bruinsma had built first, and only been detected much later, a sequence that almost always favors the builder. The true suspense at this phase of his life lies in a fact rarely acknowledged in public narratives. While his name was still unknown to the masses, his influence had already begun to bend the very map of European illicit trade. Before the newspapers ever noticed him, the ports were already reflecting his immense reach. Before investigators could even draw his profile, his network had already matured into something formidable. Before his name ever entered history, his architecture had already rewritten the supply lines of an entire continent. It's a chilling testament to strategic thinking, an invisible empire built on predictability, patience, and an unparalleled understanding of systems. By the time intelligence agencies even began whispering his name, Bruinsma's network wasn't just a plan. It was a fully functional, self-sustaining empire. Investigators weren't catching a nascent operation. They were discovering a mature, entrenched organization. This temporal disadvantage, the state playing catch-up to a system already running at full throttle, would define the next chapter of his life. Bruinsma entered this phase knowing that the rules of the game had changed. Expansion is all about taking risks, but preservation? That's where risks get you punished. He shifted his mindset completely. His focus moved to engineering longevity. This meant better compartmentalization, creating layers of insulation to protect himself from personal exposure. He established sophisticated legal front structures and built robust buffers between himself and the operational strata beneath him. What started as a personally supervised organism, with Bruinsma's hands on every lever, evolved into a smoothly delegated machine. He was no longer the sole operator. He was the architect of a system designed to run without his constant direct input. Now, you might wonder why the Netherlands remained central to his operations. It wasn't sentimentality. It was pure strategic brilliance. The country's ideal geography, with its crucial ports, liberal policies, and unparalleled trans-European connectivity, made it a natural logistics hub. Bruinsma didn't see the Netherlands as his homeland. He saw it as a platform, a neutral launchpad. From there, he threaded corridors into Germany, Scandinavia, Belgium, and Southern Europe. He didn't need to control nations. He needed to dominate pathways. He understood that indirect control of movement is far more powerful and far more subtle than direct control of territory. During this consolidation era, his alliances weren't forged through flashy displays of power, but through a shrewd alignment of incentives. He linked up with international suppliers who desperately needed reliable European importers. He partnered with European distributors who required stable upstream providers. And he integrated with financial intermediaries who needed structured, predictable revenue to cycle through their systems. Every single node that interacted with Bruinsma's network gained something incredibly valuable: predictability. And in the chaotic world of illicit operations, predictability is a currency far rarer and more prized than loyalty. That's precisely why his alliances endured, even when others around him crumbled. As his network thickened, internal tensions were inevitable. These weren't violent clashes, but rather structural frictions, disputes over margins, timing, trust chains, and adherence to protocol. Bruinsma handled instability not with confrontation, but with cold, calculated replacement. In his meticulously designed architecture, any component could be removed without degrading the entire system. This design principle, redundancy, shielded him from dependency on any single personality. Personal conflicts couldn't destabilize a network that didn't rely on irreplaceable individuals. It was a masterclass in systemic resilience. Meanwhile, state attention was slowly, steadily evolving. What had begun as scattered suspicions started to mature into a coordinated, focused interest. Intelligence briefings began to integrate data, connecting dots rather than simply archiving isolated pieces of information. His name moved from being a peripheral note to a central thread in their investigations. But here's the crucial point. While attention on him grew, admissible proof lagged far behind. Bruinsma operated expertly in that complex layer between knowledge and evidence, the layer where the state knows but simply cannot yet prove. And it's in that precise layer where the most sophisticated criminal infrastructures survived the longest. Publicly, there was still no storm. He was living in a phase where the world outside his immediate circle had yet to even hear his name, while inside his circle, people were already adjusting their behavior and their operations to his influence. This is a fundamental truth. Influence always exists privately before it ever manifests publicly. The newspapers were late to the party. The underworld, however, was already well acquainted with his power. As profits stabilized and his system achieved a kind of illicit inertia, a new complexity entered his life. And it wasn't from rivals or authorities. It came from the very psychology of scale. When an illicit network becomes an infrastructure, the founder ceases to manage daily operations and begins managing risk to his legacy. This mental pivot is incredibly dangerous, because the skills required to build a covert empire are fundamentally different from the skills required to survive ownership of one. Expansion is technical. Survival is strategic. Bruinsma entered that critical transition. He now faced a profound choice: deeper invisibility, which would require a surrender of ego and proximity, or continued personal command, which inevitably meant continued exposure. Every architect of such an underground system eventually confronts this very fork in the road. Bruinsma had built a network that could, theoretically, run perfectly well without him. Yet he didn't fully detach from it. This partial retention, this inability to completely step away, created the precise conditions in which the state could still tie the architecture to its architect. His consolidation period, ironically, was also the period in which external pressures silently accumulated. Foreign intelligence agencies began cross-referencing him. Financial institutions adjusted their compliance protocols. Law enforcement shifted tactics, moving from simply intercepting illicit products to meticulously mapping leadership structures. The invisible walls around him tightened, not through direct confrontation, but through an insidious accumulation of fragments: interviews, wiretaps, surveillance notes, financial anomalies, shipping inconsistencies. No single fragment was decisive on its own, but the archive, the body of evidence, was thickening, piece by painstaking piece. Through all of this, Bruinsma maintained the same controlled demeanor that had carried him from his youth into empire. A controlled tempo, low public exposure, and structured intermediaries. He neither flaunted his success nor recoiled from scrutiny. He behaved as though he still had more time than those who were watching him. In the ruthless calculus of the underworld, time isn't just duration. It's the critical delay between detection and conviction. As long as that delay exists, a network can breathe. It can adapt. It can survive. By the very end of his consolidation phase, two stark truths coexisted. On one hand, he remained operationally dominant, an undisputed force in his domain. On the other hand, he had irrevocably entered the range of state focus from which eventual disruption becomes, sadly, inevitable. This is the ultimate suspense line of his story. He had become too large, too powerful, to remain truly invisible. Yet he was also too deeply embedded, too intricately woven into the fabric of the criminal underworld to be easily dismantled. He occupied that incredibly narrow, precarious window where power peaks precisely as risk accelerates. It was a dangerous, exhilarating, and ultimately unsustainable position. What an incredible and complex figure, right? Bruinsma's story isn't just about crime. It's a fascinating study in strategy, organization, and the psychology of power. Imagine a structure that doesn't fall from one big hit, but slowly, meticulously, loses its equilibrium under accumulating pressure from every direction. That's the story we're exploring today, and trust me, it's a masterclass in how complex systems eventually face their limits. This phase, incredibly, began without any alarms, just like how erosion works. It's silent, gradual, and for a long time, totally invisible. For years, law enforcement agencies, both domestically and internationally, were shifting their stance. In the early days, they were asking, is there even an organized structure behind these strange anomalies we keep seeing? But as time went on, the questions evolved. They weren't asking if anymore, but who and how. And that, my friends, is when a name began to surface, not hypothetically, but as a solid reference point in high-level interagency briefings. That name was Bruinsma. Now, suspicion is one thing, but prosecution is a whole different ballgame. The intelligence community might have had a conceptual understanding of his role, but they were a long way from being able to actually act on it. Bruinsma, the architect of this vast network, was smart enough to know this. He existed in that intriguing gap between recognition and concrete, undeniable proof. And in that space, he continued to operate. Meanwhile, his network, this intricate web he had painstakingly built, was quietly undergoing a different kind of aging. Not in terms of time, but in its very structure. Think about it. Mature networks, whether legal or illegal, tend to develop a certain inertia. They become less adaptive, more bureaucratic, more reliant on established rhythms rather than constantly innovating and adjusting. The very stability that had made his enterprise so incredibly durable also made it progressively slower to respond to increasing surveillance. Routines that were once designed for efficiency now, ironically, created predictability. And predictability, as investigators will tell you, is exactly what they're looking for. It's like leaving breadcrumbs for them to follow. Internally, a subtle but significant shift was underway. What was once a culture of ambitious expansion started to morph into a culture of extreme caution. When the environment turns hostile, you notice changes in behavior. Employees, intermediaries, and associates, everyone in the network, starts to behave differently. People talk less, they trust less, and they hedge their bets more carefully. A network that once moved forward as a single, coordinated organism begins to fracture psychologically. Each individual actor starts to think about their own safety horizon, their own personal line in the sand. Even without open conflict or a big internal explosion, this silent fracture fundamentally alters the operating temperature of the entire enterprise. It's like a slow, internal freeze. Bruinsma, the mastermind, was experiencing what you might call the founder's paradox. The larger and more expansive his architecture became, the more his personal existence started to endanger the entire thing. A network of this sheer scale simply cannot afford, indefinitely, to be associated with one single identifiable origin point. To truly preserve it, to ensure its long-term survival, he would have needed to detach completely. To remove himself from the operational aura so that the structure could truly outlive him. But detachment, as many founders know, is always easier in theory than it is in practice. He remained close enough, active enough, that intelligence services could fully justify their continued, intense focus on him. At the same time, the legal and financial worlds were tightening their grip globally. We saw significant regulatory evolution, much more intense banking scrutiny, and improved port-level coordination across borders. The very same Europe that had once provided him with seemingly unmonitored corridors was now actively building sophisticated tools to detect patterns that were previously completely hidden. It's a crucial lesson here. Networks built in one legal era are always, eventually, vulnerable when that legal era fundamentally changes. Bruinsma's meticulously crafted model was optimized for yesterday's enforcement logic, not tomorrow's. In response, he attempted to compensate, not through direct confrontation, but through even deeper insulation. He built additional buffers, inserted more intermediaries, diversified his sources, and fragmented role visibility within the network. These moves, undeniably, prolonged the network's survivability. They bought him time. But they couldn't reverse the fundamental trajectory. The state, the collective power of institutions, now understood that a system existed, and more importantly, they knew he was its architect. Once the architect is identified, time, which was once a valuable asset, slowly but surely begins to turn into a liability. The clock started ticking. Here's the wild part. The general public still had absolutely no idea. Ordinary citizens were living their daily lives, completely unaware that a Dutch national had engineered one of Europe's most robust and sophisticated trafficking infrastructures. This incredible disconnect between public ignorance and profound institutional awareness is what truly defined the suspense of this entire period. His legacy was already being meticulously written in sealed government files long before his name ever appeared in any newspaper. He had become historically significant long before he had become publicly famous. Imagine that, making history in the shadows. As intelligence bodies increased their scrutiny, the margin for error inside his network shrank dramatically. In the earlier, wilder years, a mistake, even a significant one, could often be absorbed, buried, or worked around. But in these later years, a mistake became diagnostic. It was a crack that could reveal the entire underlying structure. Under such intense conditions, even the most disciplined and well-oiled networks start to accumulate microscopic vulnerabilities. A delay in a shipment, a misreported detail, a compromised intermediary, a surveillance tail that wasn't evaded cleanly enough. Each small, seemingly insignificant piece added crucial weight to the case building that was quietly happening in the background. It was like building a mosaic, one tiny tile at a time. Meanwhile, Bruinsma himself carried the immense psychological weight of operating under constant observation, but without any real clarity on what investigators actually possessed. That's a unique form of suspense, isn't it? It's not just fear, but a crippling lack of complete information. He could calculate market risk with incredible precision, but he couldn't calculate evidentiary risk. He couldn't know what they knew. The very nature of his threat shifted. It wasn't about visible rivals he could understand and outmaneuver. It was about invisible institutions whose capabilities he couldn't fully gauge. When danger becomes invisible, your instinct has less to grip onto. It's a truly unsettling position to be in. He entered a stage where he was no longer building a future empire, but desperately defending an existing one. And defense, as we know, is structurally more fragile than construction. Construction rewards bold initiative, innovation, and expansion. Defense, on the other hand, demands restraint, caution, and contraction. And restraint in an illegal infrastructure, paradoxically, is incredibly costly. Every slowed movement, every narrowed corridor, every replaced intermediary not only reduces throughput and profit, but also increases internal suspicion and friction within the network. Networks, at their core, sense when they are being defended, instead of actively driven forward. It creates a malaise, a quiet fear. As external pressure grew relentlessly, and internal fatigue started to rise within his ranks, he stood at a critical threshold. It's a point that eventually captures all architects of covert economies. The point where sheer scale, which once offered protection, now becomes profound exposure. A system that had once meticulously hidden him was now, ironically, the very reason he could be seen. The sheer magnitude of his enterprise, which had secured him immense profit and power, now attracted an irreversible concentration of state attention. This is where the pre-fall tension truly takes its final, undeniable shape. It's not an explosion, a sudden crash, or a dramatic confrontation. It's more like finding yourself in a narrowing hallway with no lateral exits, no side doors to escape through. The network might still be functioning. He might still command influence and respect within his world. But the conditions now guarantee that this continuation, this seemingly stable operation, has a very clear and increasingly close expiration date. It's a powerful reminder that even the most complex and robust systems, when operating outside the law, are ultimately subject to the relentless forces of time, scrutiny, and changing environments. No matter how brilliant the architect, no matter how insulated the structure, the equilibrium can only be maintained for so long. What an incredible and complex tale, right? It really makes you think about how pressure, both internal and external, can slowly but surely dismantle even the most formidable structures. Imagine a world where a quiet, unassuming boy from the Netherlands eventually rewired an entire nation. That's the essence of Klaas Bruinsma's story. By the time he disappeared, the criminal empire he built didn't crumble. It calcified. It professionalized. It institutionalized itself in ways that no number of arrests or reforms could fully undo. The Netherlands, and indeed Europe, had to fundamentally readjust. Think about it. Policing structures had to be rethought. Harbor scrutiny intensified. Diplomatic stances towards hashish transit countries shifted. But perhaps the most profound change was in the cultural imagination. The shock wasn't just about him. It was about realizing that one individual could turn a whole country into a smooth, quiet arterial corridor for illicit goods across an entire continent. This shock didn't fade with him. Instead, it retaught law enforcement textbooks, rewrote financial crime curricula, and reshaped the very architecture of ports. Every later trafficker who studied him saw him as a model, not because of his personality, but because of his sheer, cold, logistical genius. His disappearance didn't end his system. It fossilized his blueprint. The warehouses he once exploited didn't magically vanish. The tax havens he taught others to abuse didn't close their doors. The shell company habits he normalized lived on, under new names, operated by successors he never even met. This is the chilling nature of cold architecture. The engineer might die, but the geometry remains usable. It's a powerful, almost terrifying thought. Bruinsma's greatest triumph wasn't about money or reputation within the underworld. It was the fact that he rehearsed a future where continental trafficking would operate like a legitimate logistics firm. Standardized, data-driven, quietly routinized, and utterly emotionally detached. He replaced chaotic improvisation with systematic precision. He replaced folklore and legend with cold, hard method. In retrospect, that was the true rupture. He signaled the end of the romanticized, often clumsy, improvised smuggler. In their place emerged the disciplined, spreadsheet-grade criminal logistics executive. This wasn't some flashy gangster. This was a CEO of illicit trade. Dutch intelligence files, EU coordination memos, and academic studies repeatedly returned to this one crucial observation. Bruinsma forced Europe to recognize that crime could look exactly like infrastructure. His legacy was psychological as much as it was material. Officials were made to realize that the next major threat wouldn't wear the mask of chaos. Instead, it would wear the suit of structure. Contracts, timetables, encrypted ledgers, neutral intermediaries, and offshore accountants. It was a wake-up call that fundamentally changed how states perceived and countered organized crime. The cultural shadow he cast is equally durable. Every time Dutch reporters revisit those decades when the Netherlands was quietly leveraged into a continental gateway, Bruinsma's silhouette silently returns. Not as a larger-than-life persona, but as a format. People still debate his moral ledger, as they should, but no one debates the sheer magnitude of his structural footprint. Policy historians trace the intensification of customs protocols, the hardening of port intelligence, the tighter inter-European sharing of financial data. And time and again, they arrive at the same turning point. The Bruinsma era forced a design upgrade of the state itself. Even his failures were didactic. States studied his tactics intently to draft their counter-tactics. The manuals that describe how to block what he once opened are, unintentionally, archives of his mind. His adversaries, in a strange twist of fate, became his posthumous publishers. This is a particular kind of immortality. Not heroic, certainly not glamorous, but a method-level survivorship. Policies today speak his name without ever printing it. The narrative tension that began in his adolescence, when an unusually organized mind encountered an unusually permissive commercial landscape, does not resolve at the end of his life. His life doesn't offer a neat conclusion. It suspends. The logic he set in motion is still in motion. Think about it. There are ships today that unload in ports he once scouted. There are financial conduits still modeled on the templates he normalized. There are younger operators today who have never even pronounced his name, yet they breathe and operate inside the very geometry he established. He is a ghost, not because people actively remember him, but because people still use him without even knowing it. A ghost, after all, is just an influence without a body. And that, precisely, is what remains of him. An intact influence, body removed. Decades later, policymakers are still drafting responses to a shape of crime that he proved was possible. He isn't a myth inside memory. He is a precedent inside infrastructure. That is a heavier kind of residue than mere fame. If you strip away his biography and look only at the map, what's left is a line drawn across the Netherlands that simply didn't exist before him. A corridor of feasibility. A belief among his successors that such a corridor can be constructed and maintained. And, critically, a belief among states that such corridors must be anticipated before they even fully form. His name ceased. His profound consequence did not. His story ends, but his logic loops. And in that unresolved loop lies the entire moral instruction. Systems survive their authors. What a single private mind scripts in silence can, unbelievably, rewrite an entire public order for decades, long after that mind is gone. Legacy, in his unique case, isn't a code of glory or shame. It is a persistent, undeniable reconfiguration of how things move, how states defend, and how future players imagine possibility. He built something that outlived him. Not a monument, but a method. And methods, as we've seen, do not die. This story really makes you think about the lasting impact of individual actions, doesn't it?
The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe or join Crimology, and step deeper into the dark with us.